Oh, baby, it's horse beef coming to beef on you once again. I bet you didn't expect to get beefed on today. But it's been a while since I made like a tier list video, so I decided, I was really racking my brain to think of the most original tier list video I could make. 'Cause there's nothing really original that, or at least something that hasn't been beat to death on MMA YouTube at this point, right? Any specific topic, but I thought I would rank every single champion, undisputed champion that is, so anyone who held interim gold is not included here, only undisputed champions, and I'm going to be ranking them in terms of how well and how successful they would be against all of the other champions in their respective divisions throughout the history of these respective divisions. And for double champs, we will factor that in as well. The categories or the tiers are very self-explanatory. Beats them all, beats most of them, wins some, loses to most of them, loses to them all. Self-explanatory. Let's get into it right now, dude. Conor McGregor, he was a double champ. I can see him I can see him beating Jose Aldo because he did. I can see him beating Eddie Alvarez at lightweight because he did. As far as the other lightweight champions, the early champs, I can see him beating like Jens Pulver, Sean Shirk, guys like that. Probably even BJ Penn as well. But when it comes to featherweight, there haven't been many featherweight champions, and the only one I can see him beating is the one that he already beat, which is Jose Aldo, right? Volk beats him, and we're talking about like featherweight Conor McGregor, right? When he was actually when he had the frame to be able to make that fucking weight class. I don't know how he ever did, just based on how big he is nowadays. But yeah, I would say fucking Topuria cleans him out, Volk cleans him out, Max eats everything and walks him down. Yeah, I can really only see him beating the guy he beat. So I'm going to say, you know what, he beats one of the featherweight champs. I would say he beats a good amount of the lightweight champs. But then again, I still think he loses to most of them when you think about it, because I think as far as the lightweight champs go, like I said, I only see him really doing well against the early champions. Maybe RDA and potentially Frankie Edgar, but even then, I don't even see him beating like a prime Frankie. But Frankie was such a small lightweight that you never really know, right? But Frankie was just such a dog. I see him just getting wobbled by Conor McGregor early, gassing him out, and then just wrestle fucking him and putting a pace on him and ground and pounding him to a TKO. We get into Randy Couture, multiple time champion at multiple weight classes as well. But yeah, he fought during a very simple time. He fought during an extremely simple time. I don't think he loses to every single one, but I think like Conor McGregor, he loses to most 205 champions and heavyweight champions. He was just a one-dimensional wrestler and wasn't a particularly big heavyweight. He would even be pushing like middleweight standards in current UFC landscape. Ilia Topuria, I'm just going to stick him right at the very top. I think he beats every single featherweight champion in history without a doubt. He's already beaten the two greatest of all time. He would have beaten a prime Jose Aldo. That might be controversial to say, but I don't think it is. I think that would be a great fight. I think stylistically it's actually an awesome fight, like a prime Ilia versus a prime Jose Aldo at featherweight would be crazy. Still think he would beat him, and he cleans McGregor's clock. Yeah, for me, he does, and I even think he beats most of the lightweight champions. Even though he's not a lightweight champion, I still think he beats most of the lightweight champions in UFC history as well. My particular opinion. You don't have to agree with me, but Ilia Topuria is one of the best fighters in the world, one of the best fighters of all time, skill for skill. Like on the eye test, he's one of the greatest fighters we've ever seen, and it would be foolish to say that he doesn't knock out pretty much every single featherweight champion in history if he was able to knock out the two greatest of all time. Then we get into Brandon Moreno. Now, this is a tough one. There haven't been a whole lot of flyweight champions in UFC history, so this is a tough one to actually determine, because we've seen him lose to Pantoja multiple times. Obviously, he doesn't beat him there. When it comes to him versus DJ, I actually think that would be a close fight. When it comes to him versus Cejudo, I think that would be a close fight. If anything, I think Brandon Moreno could beat him. This is tough, but I'm just going to put Brandon Moreno in win some, loses some, just based off of the very small number of flyweight champions throughout the history of the UFC, as flyweight, I believe, is the newest division. I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that flyweight is the newest division as far as men's MMA goes. So there isn't a whole lot to go off of. Oh, I forgot about Figgy as well, who he beat. So I'm going to say, yeah, wins some, loses some. I think Cejudo would be a tough fight for him. But I think if he beats Figgy, or since he beat Figgy multiple times, I can actually see him beating Cejudo. So you know what, man? I'm actually going to go back on my word. I'm going to put Brandon Moreno here, because the only one who I see definitively beating him every time is actually Pantoja, because I think he gives DJ a genuinely tough test. So I'm going to put him up there. But yeah, like I said, it's mostly based off the fact that there aren't too many champions to go off of. Then we get into Dricus du Plessis, and I'm going to say that he beats them all. I think he beats every champion, every middleweight champion of the past. He already beat Izzy. We've already seen him beat Strickland. It was close, but you know what? I think whatever he did to Izzy, I think he does the same thing to Anderson Silva. I'm just saying. I think Anderson Silva, in retrospect, I know it's easy to say. I know recency bias comes into play and all that. But if just watch the guys that Anderson Silva's making it look easy against. Forrest Griffin, you know what I mean? His resume is not as impressive as it may have looked like back then. The difference in skill then to now is just very, very evident. Anderson Silva was too complacent. He was too playful. A guy like DDP is not going to be playing around. He's going to be running at you, full sprint, switching stances while throwing Donkey Kong punches. And that's really all there is to it. He would easily dominate Anderson Silva, choke him out, maybe even TKO him. I'm not too sure. I know DDP is extremely sloppy, and potentially with those blitzes, you would expect Anderson Silva to be able to pop him, but we've only seen him really be able to do that against guys like Chris Lieben and Forrest Griffin. DDP's a different level, man. He's a different level of toughness, of versatility, grit. I just see DDP beating every middleweight champion in UFC history. Then we get into Max Blessed Holloway. Now, this is a really tough one, although I'm going to say like he's already beaten a good few of these guys, right? I think he would beat Conor McGregor. Like I said, I know Conor McGregor beat him earlier on in Max's career, earlier in both of their careers, but I feel like the progress that Max Holloway made since that loss to Conor McGregor far, far outweighs the progress that Conor McGregor had made since that loss, and the level that we saw Max reach, when he beat Jose Aldo those 2 times, when he was styling on Brian Ortega. I think the gas tank overall in a 5-round fight against Conor McGregor would have been a nightmare for Conor. I really do think so, but we've seen Volkanovski completely dominate Max Holloway at least 2 times, right? The second fight was a bit closer, but we've seen him dominate Max Holloway 2 times. Ilia Topuria knocked him out. It's a tough one. It is a tough one to say because he's right down the middle. I mean, like we've actually seen Max Holloway fight every featherweight champion when I actually think about it. So, I mean, like there's not really much theorizing to do here. He wins some and he loses some, right? Losses to Volkanovski and Ilia Topuria, wins over Jose Aldo, and I know he has a loss to Conor McGregor, but when it comes to them as champions, championship version of Max Holloway, that upgraded version, I think he beats Conor McGregor and settles the score. That's my opinion. So I think he wins some and loses some. I guess, some of these younger divisions don't even really require much speculation because in the case of Max Holloway, we've seen him fight all of them. And for me, wins some, loses some. Peter Yan, I'm going to say beats most of them. I'm going to say beats most of them. I can't confidently say he beats them all, even though I think skill for skill, he's probably the greatest fighter we've ever seen. He's up there. I would say it's between Peter Yan, Ilia Topuria, GSP when it comes to like the most skilled fighters to ever step foot in the octagon. I just can't confidently say that he will beat Merab in the rematch when that does inevitably happen, right, barring any serious injuries. But I think every other champion in bantamweight history, aside from Merab, I think Peter Yan quite convincingly walks through them. I think he walks through TJ Dillashaw. I think he walks through Dominic Cruz. I think he walks through Renan Barão. And it would be a bloodbath. I honestly do think that Peter Yan puts a beat down on all of those past champions. The only one I can't say confidently is Merab, though. So I say Peter Yan beats most of them. Speaking of TJ Dillashaw, this is a tough one because despite the drug cheating and the controversies and all that, I don't actually think that TJ Dillashaw's legacy is completely destroyed. I think the eye test shows that it wasn't all just the steroids, right? And I don't even think he really cheated throughout the majority of his career. Maybe he did, right? But he only tested positive when he moved down to flyweight. So we can really only judge him based off what we know, and he hasn't tested positive at bantamweight, right? Through his whole career at bantamweight. So I think pump the brakes a little bit when it comes to completely tearing down TJ's legacy. There have been fighters with far, far worse cases of cheating than TJ Dillashaw. I get it, right? He moved down, had to cut the extra weight. It was tough for him. The guy looked like he was on death's doorstep, had to cheat a little bit maybe to help make the weight. And then he lost, right? It's a terrible look when you cheat and still lose. I get that. But TJ Dillashaw is still an elite fighter and one of the best bantamweights of all time. And part of me even wants to say that he beats most of them, but we've seen it, right? I think Aljamain Sterling probably still beats him, even if TJ was at full health. Marab, I think, beats him. So I'm going to say TJ wins some, loses some. I still think he beats Dominic Cruz if they fought again. He probably beats Cody Garbrandt once again if they were to fight. Yeah, I'm going to say wins some, loses some as far as TJ Dillashaw goes. And then we get into one that could be controversial. Like, I understand if you're an emotional human being, then this would be a very controversial one to rank Jose Aldo down here, but the proof is in the pudding. Conor McGregor knocked him out. You know what I mean? Knocked him out. Volkanovski beat him. Max Holloway beat him twice. And I think that Ilia Topuria beats beats Jose Aldo. So, I mean, when it comes down to it, man, even though I think Jose Aldo is greater than Max Holloway all time, probably even greater than Volkanovski all time, he's above Ilia Topuria all time as well, and he's above Conor McGregor all time. Like, when it comes to the all-time rankings, Jose Aldo is greater than the champions that I'm actually putting above him or saying that they would beat him. But the only reason why I say that is because most of them have beaten him, and Ilia Topuria most likely would beat him. No, like, even though I think, like, considering when Jose Aldo really came onto the scene, I feel like he actually stacks up to modern day standards when it comes to the skill gap. But yeah, dude, I just think they all beat him, and it sucks. It does suck. But the longevity of Jose Aldo's career is legendary. He's one of the best fighters of all time, and this isn't to say that Jose Aldo is not one of the greatest fighters of all time. That's all I'm saying, guys. But this tier list is what it is, and I have to rank fighters accordingly, and I must be objective in this sense. I know this isn't an objective list, but when it comes to scenarios like Jose Aldo, where it kind of is objective, I have to apply proper logic. I just do, guys. I just do. I'm sorry. I love Jose Aldo. He's a top 5 favorite fighter of all time for me. So it gives me no pleasure to rank him at the very bottom there. It really doesn't. And then we have Chuck Liddell, man. Chuck the Iceman Liddell. Legendary fighter, 100%. 205 is a pretty old division, though. There are a lot of champions to really think about. And I think pretty much all the new champions beat him. I think Alex Pereira puts him out. I think Yuri Prochazka beats him up at some point in that fight. I think even Jamal Hill gives him a tough time. I think Glover Teixeira beats him. Shogun, Lyoto Machida. Man, I can see him doing well against the champions of old, which he did, right? Against Tito Ortiz, Randy Couture. I know they had a bit of a back and forth, right? I think Couture ended up beating him in the series, or it might have, I don't know. It could be Chuck Liddell as well. I mean, Vitor Belfort maybe. But ultimately, I see Chuck Liddell losing to most of them. He's a bit one-dimensional. He's just a sprawling brawler. Good wrestler, but didn't really use it much except for defensively. But with really, really good hands, bombs in his hands. But may not just be enough unless you're a high-level kickboxer like Alex Pereira who can chop the legs down and you're just made of fucking mahogany. It's kind of tough to be one-dimensional and be a champion and beat all the past champions, right? Chuck Liddell, like I said, man, he's a legend, but MMA has progressed past the point where someone like Chuck Liddell could be successful at the highest level. But like I said, though, the champions of old, he beats them, and he has beaten them, right? Then we get Kamaru Usman, and I will say, even though I think he's a bit overrated, I think his resume is a bit overrated, like multiple wins over Jorge Masvidal, Colby Covington, cool dude. Yeah, I don't even know what his best win is, maybe like Gilbert Burns and all that, but he is probably the second best welterweight of all time. The only other decision there, the only other choice for that is maybe Matt Hughes, just because he has wins over BJ Penn and GSP, right? Very impressive wins. But ultimately, I think that Kamaru Usman, he probably goes out there and beats every other welterweight champion of all time other than GSP. I don't think he beats GSP, but Usman probably beats most of them. And then we get into Alex Pereira. Oh boy, we've seen him beat Jan Blachowicz, even if it was razor thin. But at the end of the day, John Jones fucks him up. Prime DC fucks him up, probably ragdolls him at some point in that fight. I can see him doing well against every other light heavyweight champ of all time, most likely. But when it comes to DC and John Jones, I just don't see it. But that would be most of them, though, right? I do actually see Alex Pereira beating majority of 205 champions throughout history. But yeah, DC John Jones, just a no-go, but I still think Alex beats most of them. Then we get Volkanovski. Same exact ranking. He has to go in the same spot. He beats most of them because he already beat Jose Aldo. I think he would beat prime Jose Aldo. Like a prime Volkanovski definitely would. Beat Max Holloway 3 times. He would 100% just walk Conor McGregor. And Ilya knocked him out. So, like I said with Max Holloway, there's not really much to think about here, not much to speculate about. It's just what it is. He beats most of them because he's beaten most of them, right? I mean, not Conor McGregor, but he probably would if we're being real here. Then we get into Rashad Evans, pretty decent. He was. I wouldn't say he was like the golden standard for MMA, but he kind of was at the time for 205. He's a good wrestler, had pretty good hands, good power, decent round kick as well, but just very rudimentary. And I would put him on a similar level to someone like Chuck Liddell when it comes to overall skill. So I wouldn't say he loses to all of them, but he definitely loses to most of them. But luckily for him, there have been 205 champions like fucking Forrest Griffin. So yeah, Rashad beat someone like him. Therefore, I can't rank him in loses to them all because I just don't see that to be the case. You know what I mean? Then we have Luke Rockhold, and I'll say something similar. I think he loses to most of them. You could say he wins some, loses some, but can you see him beating DDP? Myself personally, I can't. You see him beating Israel Adesanya, just maybe if he mixes in the wrestling, right? We've seen him beat Chris Weidman. Do you think he beats a prime Anderson Silva? Maybe if he mixes in the wrestling. Bisping knocked him out, but he also beat Bisping, and maybe he was overconfident going into that. I think if they fought again afterwards, he probably could have beaten Bisping. Yeah, that's a tough one when it comes to middleweight champions, dude. But I think Strickland just jabs him and eventually TKOs him. I think Robert Whittaker TKOs him. So yeah, when it comes down to it, Luke Rockhold I think loses to a good majority of these champions. Then we get into Robbie Lawler. Now this is kind of a tough one. I would say win some, lose some. He had two very good fights with Johnny Hendricks, juiced up Johnny right before Johnny got completely exposed by USADA and went on his downward spiral, moved up to middleweight because he could no longer cut the weight and all that. But that version of Johnny Hendricks gave a great fight to the greatest fighter of all time in GSP. Robbie Lawler went up against that version of Johnny Hendricks, had a great fight with him, as I said, 2 times. Won one, lost one. It's razor thin between the two of them, man. And that version of Johnny Hendricks is scary. He himself is probably one of the best welterweights of all time. If you think about him during that specific era, Johnny Hendricks was a scary son of a bitch. Robbie Lawler, had great fights with him. I don't think he beats GSP. I'm not sure if he beats Kamaru Usman. I could see him maybe knocking out Matt Hughes, just maybe. I don't know, dude. It is tough. Fucking Tyrone Woodley knocked him out cold. Yeah, it is. It's a tough sell, but then I think back to maybe some early welterweight champions. I think he beats BJ Penn. I think Bilal might just grind him out, do like Colby did. But a prime Robbie Lawler, I still think that Bilal could maybe get that done. But honestly, I could also see Robbie Lawler because in his prime, dude, he was a great sprawling brawler, just like I said about Chuck Liddell. Like Robbie Lawler has always been great at staying on the feet and piecing up his opponents. But you know what? I could also see him beating all the old ones, like fucking Pat Miletich and them. And ultimately, I see him beating Leon Edwards as well. I don't think Leon Edwards' style would work against someone like Robbie Lawler. I really don't think so. So I would say win some, lose some as far as Robbie Lawler goes, man. Now, Tim Sylvia in particular benefits from the fact that he's a heavyweight, and there have been some terrible heavyweight champions throughout history, including himself. He was just a size merchant. He got beat up by like a 42-year-old Randy Couture who, as I said, would be like a middleweight in today's standards, which is pretty embarrassing, honestly. But then you think back to some of the older heavyweight champions like Josh Barnett and Rico Rodriguez. Do I have to really go on? Like, yes, he would beat some of the champions, but only down to the age of the heavyweight division and how low level some of the older heavyweight champions have been. Speaking of heavyweight champions, we do also have Frank Mir right here, the one-dimensional jiu-jitsu specialist, some of the best jiu-jitsu in heavyweight history, quite frankly. But he was very one-dimensional. I think he beat Brock Lesnar once, lost to Brock Lesnar. I don't know. I do see a lot of past heavyweight champions beating up Frank Mir. I mean, we've seen it. We have seen it. But ultimately, dude, when I think about it, he probably should rank in loses to most of them because I do think he loses to most of them. And then we get into Tyrone Woodley, a prime Tyrone Woodley. We saw him lose to Kamaru Usman. That was a great win for Usman because it was before the massive losing streak for Woodley. At this time, Woodley was actually being picked all over the place to beat Kamaru. So this is before he was considered to be a washed-up fighter. GSP cleans him out. I think he probably beats Matt Hughes. He could probably beat BJ Penn. You know what? He knocked out Robbie Lawler, dude. Yeah, dude. I would actually say that Tyron Woodley wins some, loses some. I would rank him on a similar position or in a similar position to where I would rank Robbie Lawler. And I think that's fair. Pat Miletich, listen, he probably loses to them all. And that's in no way meant to be disrespectful to Pat Miletich. He is a legend. He's the first ever UFC welterweight champion, and that kind of spells it out for you right there. He had some defense. I think he had like 4 defenses, which is very impressive. But then came along Carlos Newton, who beat him, and I personally think that Carlos Newton would lose to every other welterweight champ in history. Spoiler alert. So yeah, Pat Miletich unfortunately has to be ranked at loses to them all, and it's just such a weird sight to see Jose Aldo ranked alongside Pat Miletich on a list like this. It's crazy, but it does make sense when you think about it. Then we get into Dominic Cruz. Now, I'm not too sure where to rank him because I'm not huge on Dominic. I think his style doesn't really lend itself to success, especially in a modern MMA landscape. Peter Yan, I think, walks through him. I think TJ Dillashaw beats him majority of the time. We've seen him lose to Cody Garbrandt. Maybe he beats Cody Garbrandt again, but I don't think he possesses enough power, enough danger in his hands to really threaten a guy like Garbrandt with that speed advantage. Renan Barao would probably have a good time against Dominic Cruz. I'm not gonna lie, due to prime Renan Barao. Marav Dvalishvili fucks him up, man. This is a tough one, dude. I'm actually having a real tough time here. We saw Henry Cejudo beat him, and I think a prime Henry Cejudo beats a prime Dominic Cruz as well, man. This is real tough. But at the end of the day, I kind of have to rank Dominic Cruz there just because of the level of bantamweight, right? It's a newer division. He's one of the older champions at bantamweight. So you have to consider it like that. I think he loses to a good majority of them. I'm honestly just teetering the line of putting him at the very bottom, loses to them all. I'm not too sure he does. I think maybe he could beat Cody Garbrandt potentially if they fight again. Potentially if they were to fight once again, he could beat him. We've seen him beat Dillashaw, right? So the proof is there. But I just think stylistically, he actually doesn't pose a lot of danger to many of the bantamweight champions throughout history. I really don't think so. I think Peter Yan finishes him in 4 rounds, I think. That's a tough one for me, dude. But I could maybe see Dominic Cruz beating like one other bantamweight champion in history. He probably struggles against Aljo too. Sean O'Malley, that would be a tough one, man. It's honestly a tough matchup. I think he could give O'Malley a tough time if he mixes in the wrestling effectively, but eventually I could see Sean catching him with something, man, as he fades away. Yeah, I'm going to keep Dominic Cruz there. Maybe controversial because to some people, he's the best, right? If you don't consider Merab to be the best bantamweight of all time, to many people, he's the greatest, right? So it's strange, but greatness is much different. Right? This isn't a conversation of greatness. This is a conversation of whether these champions would beat one another, and whether I think that Dominic Cruz would lose to this guy or that guy doesn't mean that they're greater than Dominic Cruz, right? That's just how it is, and I'm sure you guys understand that, but I'm just expecting comments from people who just completely miss the point of what this tier list is actually trying to say. Then we get into BJ Penn. I can see him beating a good few champions, right? Fucking Woodley probably beats him up, and he was kind of a small welterweight too. He's pretty much only at welterweight because he was too lazy to cut weight. I'm trying to think of a welterweight champ that wouldn't beat him. Bilal could maybe struggle against BJ for like a round or two, but then would probably wear on him. Robbie Lawler would probably beat him up after a bit. Maybe Leon Edwards. Nah, this is a tough one, man. I'm gonna put BJ Penn here and loses to most of them, but we have seen him beat Matt Hughes, right? We have seen him beat welterweight champions. And I think he beats the older ones as well. I think he actually did beat Carlos Newton. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm pretty sure he did. And when it comes to lightweight champions, I can't think of a whole lot that he would beat either. Yeah, we've seen him lose multiple times to Frankie Edgar, who, as I said, is a pretty small lightweight to go along with that. Yeah, I would say between, he was a 2 weight class champion, but I think between lightweight and welterweight, there are more champions that would beat him versus that he would beat. So I'm going to rank BJ Penn at loses to them all. Loses to most of them, even though he's honestly an all-time great for me. He's one of my favorite fighters. Like, growing up, he was arguably my favorite fighter in the world growing up. I put BJ Penn on a pedestal. And I'm Canadian, and I rated him above GSP. That's how much I loved BJ Penn growing up. So pains me to put him there, but it's probably the truth, man. And then we have Renan Barão, loses to most of them too. He definitely does. Actually, wait, does he lose to them all? Probably, when I think about it. Yeah, he does. He loses to them all. All of them. Renan Barão loses to them all. Even though at one point he was one of the best fighters in the world. He was scary. He was genuinely a scary, scary champion at one point. So it's weird, man. But that's just how it goes, man. These newer weight classes are brutal when it comes to these rankings. And then we have Sean Shirk, the Muscle Shark. I'm going to say he loses to them all, man. I think he held the belt for a brief stint and then was stripped of it because of steroids, so he arguably shouldn't even be here, but I'm just going to put him in loses to them all. Rich Franklin, you could argue the same thing, but he beat Evan Tanner to get the belt, right? Evan Tanner, he's going to be on this list, very low down on it, by the way. Murilo Bustamante was a champion before him, and it was, I think, Dave Mene before that. They should all be ranked at the very lowest. But Rich Franklin would probably beat those guys, and he put up a couple of title defenses as well, and unfortunately had to run into the greatest middleweight of all time, Anderson Silva. So it's not like Rich Franklin is terrible or anything, but aside from the champions that came before him, I don't see him beating any of them. DDP would do nasty things to him. Then we get Triple C, right? Bantamweight champ. Who did he even beat to get that bantamweight title? Marlon Moraes. Okay, he looked like a killer at that time. Not too bad. Although Peter Yan would really, really do some nasty things to him. Marab, we've already seen him beat up Triple C. I think Triple C struggles with a lot of the newer champions as well. I think a prime Dominic Cruz gives Triple C some problems, maybe, right? He didn't exactly fight the best version of Dominic Cruz when he did finish him. Didn't even fight the best version of TJ Dillashaw when he finished him, man. It's really tough to rank Triple C, man, because I know he's an all-time great double champion and all that, but I think when you get down to it, I can only rank him in the middle. I think he wins some, loses some, because I think a lot of champions like Brandon Moreno, for example, give this dude some real trouble at flyweight, and I could think of probably a majority of bantamweight champs throughout history that would give and have given Triple C some trouble, right? We've seen him against Merab, gave him trouble. We saw him against Aljamain Sterling. It was a close fight, but he lost it. So, yeah, I would say he's right in the middle of the pack, even though he's an all-time great and all that. Then we get into Matt Serra. He loses to every champion, I think. I think he loses to every single one. Maybe you could argue that he would beat someone like a Pat Miletich, or he would beat somebody like a fucking Carlos Newton, probably, right? You would think so. But ultimately, man, is Matt Serra, was he ever one of the most elite fighters of all time? Not really. But he did get it done versus GSP, and I can't disrespect him, right? Because there were champions before him that were lower level. Yeah, Matt Serra. It's weird to even rank him alongside guys like Chuck Liddell. And Conor McGregor being in there as well is so strange. But Matt Serra benefits from being a part of an older division where there are older champions that just did not display the same level of MMA. And then we have Bas Rutten, way too small for heavyweights, right? So he would just get beaten down by a majority of heavyweight champions throughout history just by virtue of that alone. Maybe he beats someone like Maurice Smith, could potentially beat Kevin Randleman, which he did, I believe, to become the UFC champion. But his tenure in the UFC was so short. I don't know. Like I said about the last fighter who I ranked as well, he benefits from heavyweight being such an old division to the point where, yes, he would beat some of the older champions, but all the new ones completely smoke Bas Rutten just based off the fact that he would be so small for that division nowadays. He would be so small. He would get completely fucked up by everybody from the last 2 to 3 generations of heavyweights, 100%. So I would say, yeah, loses to most of them is a fair ranking. Arguably, you could put him down here, but as I said, man, heavyweights, or the heavyweight division has had some real stinker champions throughout history. So yeah, loses to most of them for Bas Rutten. And then we have Frank Shamrock, and I'm just going to stick him in loses to them all. The first ever light heavyweight champion of all time. Just look at the list of light heavyweight champions that came after him. They would absolutely clean his clock, 100%. Then we get to Murilo Bustamante. I believe he was a middleweight champion, one of the worst of all time, and I think I'll rank him down there as well. Listen, even if he has a win over a past middleweight champion to become middleweight champion, I still think that any champion that has come before or after him could beat him, right? Even the ones that have beaten him, he's just that kind of a champion. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to justify ranking him anywhere above that. Then we get into Merab Dvalishvili, and I am going to stick him into beats them all, because Merab beats every single bantamweight champion in history, and you cannot prove me. You cannot prove otherwise. Seriously, he's beaten some of the best bantamweights of all time. The current run that he's on, stylistic mismatches on paper turn out to be just as easy as every other matchup for Merab Dvalishvili, and that would stay true, because we've seen him gas out fighters like Peter Yan, Henry Cejudo, right? Fighters who have never shown a propensity to gas out in the past. So all that tells me is that he could do the same thing to Renan Barão, do the same thing to TJ Dillashaw, completely destroy a guy like Cody Garbrandt and get him to gas out. It would just be funny to see how Merab does that to every other champion in bantamweight history, because he would absolutely do it 100%. 100%. Everyone just has a puncher's chance against this guy, but even then you don't have much of one, because he's tough as nails, and the longer the fight goes, the lesser chance you have of knocking the dude out. He is a cheat code. Merab Dvalishvili beats every bantamweight champion to ever come before him. And then we have Rampage Jackson. Tough one. He was a decent grappler, like half decent. He lost to someone like Rashad Evans, you know what I mean, after that amazing legendary Ultimate Fighter season. He's good. He is good, man. But he was kind of just a one-dimensional boxer. And I think he gets beaten by most of the 205 champions that have come around in the last 5 years, 10 years even. I'm going to say Rampage Jackson loses to most 205 champions throughout history. And oh boy, then we have John Bones Jones. And it's unfortunate that I have to rank him up here, but I just do. I don't care if he's a drug. I mean, I do care that he's a drug cheat, but that has no bearing on my ranking here. We've never had an example of him losing a fight technically. And I have no reason to believe that someone like Poatan would get it done against him, or Jamal Hill, for God's sake, or Yuri Prochazka. Honestly, if we really get down to it, John Jones would probably beat all of them. If we're being completely real, you don't have to like him to come to that conclusion. It just kind of is the way it is. And then we have Matt Hughes, one-dimensional wrestler. I think he would get beat up by a lot of the current champions. Last 3, 4, 5 champions would have a really good time against Matt Hughes. I only see Matt Hughes doing it again, done against some of the earlier welterweight champions, which he did, right? He has a win over GSP, as I said. BJ Penn, right? Couple of good wins. Carlos Newton as well, he has a win over him. But I think just based on that, it's hard to say, just based on the fact that he was such a good wrestler, but he was one-dimensional, right? Guys like Kamaru Usman would beat him up. Woodley would have beaten him up. I'm going to say Matt Hughes, a bit outdated in terms of his style. He's just like an old-school American wrestler, didn't have much of anything else, and that would have gotten him hurt, especially if you're matching him up in his prime against some of the newer champions in their prime. Demetrius Johnson, I'm going to say he beats most of them. I'm I'm sorry. I know DJ is one of the greatest fighters of all time. I get it. But I personally think that Pantoja beats him. And that's a spoiler. I know we're going to have Pantoja coming up in a bit. But I think Pantoja beats him, and that could be controversial, but I think he does. I think Pantoja has the style, right, that marauding style to walk through somebody like DJ, and that's a scary thought. I know DJ would have him beat as far as the overall skill set, right? The skill differential would be pretty crazy, but Pantoja's a different animal. He's a different animal, and he's just been dogging it up with this current new elite generation of flyweights that DJ just never really got the chance to go up against, right? He never really got to test himself against the level of competition that Pantoja is beating over and over and over again, and essentially cleaning out his division. So for me, Pantoja beats DJ, and for that reason, DJ beats most other flyweight champions in history. And he also lost to Cejudo, but has a win over Cejudo, but arguably beat Cejudo 2 times. Depends on how you see that fight, really. Benson Henderson, a very underrated champion, I would say. Very underrated champion. And I think middle of the pack is perfectly fine for him. He beat Frankie Edgar twice, right? So he has a win over a pretty elite lightweight champion, but watch that fight, man. He looks so much smaller than Benson Henderson. But Benson was very well-rounded. I wouldn't say he was ahead of his time, but he displayed a good, diverse skill set for MMA, especially for the time period. I can see him doing pretty well against some lightweight champions of new. Definitely not Islam, definitely not Khabib, maybe a guy like Conor McGregor and all that. Honestly, man, I think the skill set, he was a bit ahead of his time, I would say. A bit ahead of his time. Benson Henderson was very underrated, so I will put him in the middle of the pack and say that he wins some and loses some 100%. And then we have Ricardo Rodriguez. I'm just going to put him down here. I know he has a win over Randy Couture, but listen, the light heavyweight and heavyweight divisions back then were just the Wild West. Fights, fucking everyone was beating each other back then, and I really just think that it comes down to skill. Like when you match them up skill for skill, a guy like Ricardo Rodriguez fought at a time, at like a barbaric time in MMA. When you go skill for skill, he loses to all of them 100%. And yes, there will be some overlap here, because you might ask, like, how can, I don't know, for example, how could Pat Miletich lose to them all, but Sean Shirk also lose to them all? Listen, it's just based off the majority. Like, if you can beat one singular champion throughout history, in my opinion, then you're still going to be ranked at the very bottom. When it comes to loses to them all, you have to at least be justifiably able to defeat at least more than one past champion. You know what I mean? So Ricardo Rodriguez is going to be ranked at the very bottom, and I think that is 100% fair. Kevin Randleman, just based off the fact that he was such a physical specimen, had a massive right hand, a fantastic wrestler, right? Just built like a brick shithouse, a proper heavyweight. I'd say he loses to most heavyweight champions in history, but just based off the athleticism alone, that could probably give him a few wins against some of the earlier champions. In fact, he has beaten some of the earlier champions. I would say Kevin Randleman loses to them all. Vitor Belfort. This is a tough one, because young Vitor was a scary man, fast, so fast, good striker, explosive. You can even consider TRT Belfort to be his prime, but he wasn't holding a belt back then. So we're talking about younger version of Vitor Belfort. It's a tough one. It is a tough one, because we've seen him go up against a good number of these champs, at least the ones that were available for him to compete against at 205. Around that time period. He has a win over Couture, I think a loss to him as well. Then I think about these modern day 205ers, and they're so big. Vitor would not do very well against this current lineup of 205ers. I'd say any of the past 3-4 champions would probably beat Vitor, but it's just so hard to say, because he was so explosive and powerful and fast that, theoretically he could spark anybody out cold, really. But we've seen that at the highest level, Vitor Belfort doesn't exactly have the craziest resume in the world, right? It's like a tale of two different careers, right? There's TRT Belfort, and then there's him as a 20-year-old man, where he's just going on a tear, blitzing Vanderlei Silva right off the bat and TKOing him. You know what I mean? Inconsistent career. I would say Vitor Belfort probably loses to most of them, though, if I'm being completely real here. Mark Coleman, same thing. I would say he arguably he loses to them all. I know he does have some impressive wins, and he's a legend. 100% he's a legend. He really is. No one can deny the legendary status of Mark Coleman, so this is not meant to be disrespectful. I just mean stylistically, he's been so outdated. The guy had no defense. He didn't even really have a good gas tank. He was just a fucking juice monkey wrestler, like a lot of fighters were back then, and his style nor his steroids would hold up nowadays, so I'm going to say he loses to them all. Bilal Muhammad is a real tough one, man, because I'm thinking, you put him up against Kamaru Usman. What do you think he does to Kamaru Usman? Does he have superior hands? Maybe. They both have a pretty good jab, right? I would say that Kamaru Usman has the advantage in the power, but when it comes to the striking, I know a lot's made of Bilal's boxing. Oh, he showed a good jab against Leon Edwards. No, his hands are still not that good, and there's no real pop in his punches. Kamaru Usman hasn't beat there, but I could see maybe Bilal weighing on him with the pace. I think GSP beats the shit out of Bilal 100%. We've already seen Bilal ragdoll and bonk again Leon Edwards right on his dome top, so we have proof of that. I think Robbie Lawler would probably succumb to the pressure and the pace. It's tough, dude, but I'm actually saying that Bilal beats most of them. Stylistically, he beats most of them throughout history. I think he destroys Colby Covington as well. He's just a better version of what Colby Covington's always been. So I'm going to say Bilal beats most welterweight champs throughout history. We get Cain Velasquez. This is a tough one. Well, I'm going to say he beats most of them. I want to rank him up here, kind of, but I just don't think so. I don't think he beats every champion throughout history. But I also have to consider John Jones, man. I'm looking at John Jones now. What am I saying, dude? Do I think he beats every heavyweight champ? Do I think he beats a prime Stipe? I don't know if he does. Do I think he beats a prime Kane? I'm not too sure he does. So I'm actually moving John Jones down because I didn't even really factor in him as a heavyweight champ. So we need to think of it that way. Does this heavyweight John Jones beat every champion? I'm not too sure he does. And I'm also not too sure that Cain Velasquez does. It's a flip of the coin, and it's pretty impossible to rank any heavyweight champ at the very top and confidently say that they beat every other heavyweight just based on how dicey it is to be a heavyweight, right? And there's a reason why the record amount of title defenses is like 3 for heavyweights. Is because of how dangerous it is to be a heavyweight champion, because anything can happen. Anyone can beat you. Anyone can knock you out. That's just kind of how it works. But Cain Velasquez, I think, beats most champions throughout history. And then we have Lyoto Machida. This is a tough one because I think when you think about his style, right, that karate, that kind of point fighting, like counter punching style of Lyoto Machida's, I feel like it would hold up pretty well in the middleweight division when you think about some of these champions, right? You think about Israel Adesanya. I think a prime Adesanya would still beat Lyoto Machida. I think Anderson Silva still beats Lyoto Machida. DDP beats Lyoto Machida 100%. I think Lyoto would maybe give a tough time to Luke Rockhold, but even then, stylistically, he doesn't look great in these matchups, man. So I'm thinking that Lyoto, as much as I love Lyoto Machida, he drinks his own piss, though, and that's weird as fuck, isn't it? It's just so weird. It's tough to say he loses to most of them, but arguably he does, so I'm going to rank him there, man. And then we have Fabricio Verdum, arguably one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, and he was always a wild card with his very high-level jiu-jitsu, especially for heavyweights, right? And he has some super impressive wins on his resume. Has a win over fucking Fedor Emelianenko. I believe Cain Velasquez as well. So he's beaten some of the best heavyweights of all time. And like I said about that wild card, for me, he's just a better version of Frank Mir. I've always really respected Fabricio Verdum. Funny guy as well. Has one of the craziest resumes of all time. If you actually go and take a look at the names on that resume, I can say he wins some, loses some. I would say he's middle of the pack as far as overall or all-time heavyweights go. Fucking fantastic fighter. He was very underrated, very underappreciated as well. Then we have Evan Turner, one of the most generic human beings to ever step foot in the octagon, I suppose, just as far as the name goes and everything. His style, he doesn't exactly do himself any favors for fighting in the time period that he did, right? I know he can't exactly control that, though, but yeah, he would lose to every champion. I believe this is the champion that Rich Franklin originally defeated to become middleweight champion, and I'm sure I will have no arguments there. Fucking Josh Barnett, I'm going to stick him in the same spot. I just never really rated him. The fact that he ever held a title is interesting to me. Then we have Jens Pulver. Now this is tough because he always had bombs in his hands, but he fought during such a simple time. But he was a dog. He was a dog of a lightweight. He really was. But can I see him beating other lightweight champs throughout history? Not necessarily, but I don't think he loses to all of them, though. I think he loses to most of them. I will say that, though. But I would say that's pretty respectable considering that he is probably one of the oldest fighters in this ranking. So I would say that's actually pretty respectable. Then we get into Maurice Smith. Won't get much more into it. He loses to all of them. Yes, he has a win over Mark Coleman, but that's really the only champion I could see him ever beating. I know he beat him, right? So it's not about seeing him beating him. He beat him. But at the same time, Mark Coleman on any other day could have probably beaten Maurice Smith at that time. The skill level, especially at these heavier weight classes, was just so low. It was really like every fight was just a 50-50 as far as I'm concerned. And then we have Sean O'Malley. Now, this is a very interesting case. Very interesting. Because he has a win over Peter Yan. You guys know how I feel about that. TJ Dillashaw, I think, gives Sean O'Malley some problems, right? If he mixes in the wrestling, I think he gives him issues. I think same thing goes for Dominic Cruz. If he mixes in the wrestling, he might be too slick for him, but I can still see Sean, man, with that accurate striking that he has. I can see him landing like a sharp right hand on the chin, man. I can see him timing something on Dominic Cruz. I feel like I have to be very much fair to Sean O'Malley here. It's honestly tough to see him losing to every single champion. I'm even trying to justify it because you guys know I'm a big Sean O'Malley hater. I'm even trying to justify ranking him at loses to most of them, but I really gotta have to sit here and ponder that for a moment. You know, he probably beats Barao, for sure beats Garbrandt. Triple C, it would be a tough one. That's kind of a dicey one to predict. I'm gonna say wins some, loses some. As a hater of Sean O'Malley, I'm going to say he wins some and he loses some, right? He did chin Aljamain Sterling. Yeah, the circumstances were in his favor, but The facts are the facts, right? He chinned Aljamain Sterling, and that's kind of just how it is. Carlos Newton loses to them all, and I will say nothing about it once again. He's pretty much lost to them all already, and I know, sure, yes, I think he has a win over Pat Miletich. That is the only one he's beaten, and the only one who I can see him beating, and they're both the worst champions of all time in their respective divisions. But that's, of course, no disrespect to them as fighters. It's all down to the time period in which they competed, and that's all. And then we have Sean Strickland, went to war with DDP, had a razor-thin fight. Stylistically, he is a tough nut to crack, and Sean Strickland is such a tough nut to crack because he sticks to that game plan no matter what. He does not deviate from it. He's so defensively responsible, a great defensive wrestler as well. Sean Strickland is a fucking nightmare, man. He is a nightmare matchup for pretty much everybody because he is so goddamn stubborn and will not deviate from the game plan, will never leave himself open for counter shots. It's so hard to catch Sean Strickland. It really is hard to catch Sean Strickland. He's one of the best middleweights of all time, I would say, at this point. He's probably like a top. I mean, he's for sure in the top 10 at this point, absolutely, just considering some of the resume he's put up, right? And even just going and having such a razor-thin fight for 5 rounds with someone like DDP just shows the level that he's at. And I think stylistically, when it comes to skill for skill, right, I wouldn't say that he's better than Anderson Silva. But when it comes to the stylistic matchup, I can see him beating Anderson Silva and beating a good majority of middleweight champions throughout history. The only one who I see as being a bad matchup for Sean potentially is DDP. He's really the only one. He's the only one. So I'm saying that Sean Strickland beats a majority of middleweights throughout history. You might disagree, but I don't give a fuck. And then we get into Brock Lesnar. This one is tough, man, because he was just such a physical specimen that anything could happen in his fights. Truly, truly anything could happen in his fights. But he was just so green, and he wasn't there on a skill level, right? He got completely beat up by Cain Velasquez, who looked like 2 sizes smaller than Brock Lesnar in there. I think John Jones, this heavyweight John Jones, probably makes pretty easy work of Brock Lesnar, makes him look silly in there. I would say loses to most of them. Nah, you know what? I'm going to be fair to Brock Lesnar. Beat Frank Mir, and it is an old division now, isn't it? It is an old division, but the heavyweight title does change hands pretty quickly. And I just think the puncher's chance that he has, the wrestling pedigree, the athleticism at heavyweight, it actually does make a difference, right? Being a supreme athlete, it makes a big difference at heavyweight. So I will put Brock Lesnar in wins some, loses some. When it comes to Cody Garbrandt, I'm just going to say he loses to most of them. He really most likely only beats somebody like Dominic Cruz, who he matches up well with stylistically. Andrei Arlovsky, at his time, very, very natural, as you can see. He was built like a brick shithouse. He looked like the real-life Wolverine. I don't know, man. He fought it in a simple time. The longevity is impressive, but I think when you get down to it, he loses to most heavyweight champions throughout history. Eddie Alvarez, when it comes to lightweight champions, it's hard to see him beating very many of them. In fact, I don't see him beating many of them at all. So I'm going to say loses to most of them as well. RDA, that would be a lightweight champion he was, I believe. Yep, a lightweight champ. Tough to say, but I'd say he loses to most of them as well. I do think so. I think the level of lightweight in the last few champions, right? You think about Khabib, you think about Islam. RDA is not touching them. I mean, he already got the chance against Khabib and couldn't do shit to him. But I think that even champions of the past could have a decent chance against someone like RDA when it comes to just stylistically. RDA is more of a jack of all trades rather than being a master of anything. You know what I mean? I would say loses to most of them. When it comes to Forrest Griffin, I can see him beating a few 205 champions throughout history. I know he's probably one of the lowest level champions on this list when you really get down to it. Rich Franklin was mostly heart. He didn't have a whole lot in terms of striking, didn't have a whole lot in terms of grappling. Kind of like what I said about RDA, like a jack of all trades, but to a much lower degree. Although I can't even disrespect Rich Franklin because, like I said about other 205 and heavyweight champions, he benefits from the fact that he fought in a lower skill level division at in a time period where the skill level was supremely low, especially as far as professional MMA goes. When you compare it, comparatively to current heavyweight fighters, think about Tom Aspinall, 205ers, it should be Yuri Prochazka, for example. You fucking stick Yuri Prochazka in a time machine, send him to that era, and he's cleaning out the 205 division the way I see it. It's just the way I see it, man. And Rich Franklin, I would say, loses to most 205 champions throughout history. Now, when it comes to Shogun Rua, I actually think he's on the Mount Rushmore of 205ers. He was very small for the division. These days, he would most definitely, like, if he was in his prime in the UFC nowadays, he would probably fight at middleweight most likely. But I think he's probably the best of that generation of 205ers. And I think he beats all of them from that generation and would give a tough fight to some of the more recent 205 champs. I know he was small, but he was a dog. He hit like a truck, man. He really did hit like a truck, and has picked up some great wins. But I'm thinking like a prime. I mean, I guess Shogun, like when he was a champion in the UFC, wasn't even technically in his prime. He's not, he wasn't even really in his prime. But I still think that what he did in the UFC, man, like when he joined the UFC, I think he was still in his late 20s, but he was so broken down from all those fights in Pride, right? Fighting so consistently, Grand Prix and all that. The man was like the equivalent of a 35-year-old man. But Prime Shogun, I guess we're considering the Pride version, although we're talking about UFC titles, we have to consider the UFC champion version of Shogun. I think he wins some or loses some. Like 205 has never been the greatest division. And as I said, I think Shogun Rua beats the 205 champions of that era. So even though he loses to probably every other 205 champion that's come since then, because you have to consider who they've really been, right? John Jones beat him for the belt, was it? I'm pretty sure he beat Shogun for the belt. You know, DC would ragdoll someone like Shogun Rua. Jamal Hill would maybe just be too big, but I can see someone like Shogun weathering the storm, chopping the legs down, maybe TKOing him. But as I said, Jamal Hill's so big. I think Yuri Prochazka versus like a prime Shogun would be a fun-ass fight. That would be such a fun fight, dude. People really write off Shogun. He gets a lot of disrespect. Or people just really don't remember the guy or know much about him. But he was a serious fucking problem. And yeah, for me, he wins some and loses some. Tito Ortiz, I'm going to say he loses to most of them, right? Early era 205er, small guy, loses to pretty much every current champion, recent champion in the last 5 to even like 10 years at 205. His style is outdated, as I keep saying about these one-dimensional wrestlers, and that's just as simple as it is, right? He couldn't even really get it done against someone like Chuck Liddell, who stylistically he matches up pretty well against on paper, but kept getting knocked out by him and was only able to return the favor once Chuck Liddell was CTE ridden, and that was the worst fight of all time, and I now want to re-erase it from my fucking memory, because this video has now brought up very unfortunate memories that I would like to repress, because fuck that fight. Tito Ortiz, master of the English language, though. If we're talking about English language tier list, he is at the very, very top. But I think he loses to most 205 champions throughout history. Then we have Glover Teixeira. This is a real tough one, man, because he didn't win the belt until he was like 40. So we're talking about 40-year-old old man Glover Teixeira. But he beat Jan Blachowicz, man, who looked so scary at that time. And he was on the cusp of beating Yuri Prochazka. If he doesn't make that one mistake, he probably beats Yuri Prochazka that night. On the scorecards, he probably does. Right? I'm not too sure what happened that night against Jamal Hill. I don't really understand what happened. Maybe the age caught up with him that night. But I think stylistically, he poses an issue against Jamal Hill. I think he really does. Obviously, we would never see him going against Poatan, so that's a weird one to even think about. But I think the past champions, well, he beats most of them. I'm having a hard time not ranking Glover Teixeira up here. So I think Glover Teixeira beats most 205 champions in history. I think he does. I think he does, man. Fuck, I think he does. Yeah, I'm keeping him there. And then we have Dave Mene, and I'm just going to put him there. Who the fuck's Dave Mene? And then we have Leon Edwards. Ooh, this is a real tough one, because I think, skill-wise, a lot of people rank Leon Edwards so highly. I think he's so one-dimensional, though, right? He's a good grappler, good defensive wrestling, pretty good offensive wrestling as well. When it comes to his striking, where he's apparently one of the best in the UFC, this dude is so fucking one note on the feet. He just has a round kick. It's the only shot of his. Yes, he has a pretty good straight left, but he keeps that chin so far out. It's like he's half in, half out. He barely even commits to his shots. I can see him getting pieced up by a lot of champions because he has never had the heart. It was a Hail Mary left high kick that made him a champion in the first place. And then Usman came in looking like an old man all of a sudden when they fought for the third time, and then he gets bonked in his head by fucking Bilal Muhammad. Before that, he goes up against the worst, like one of the worst versions of any fighter we've ever seen of all time in Colby Covington. He's washed. For me, I think Leon Edwards actually loses to a good majority of welterweight champions throughout history. Maybe that's just the hater in me, the hater of Leon Edwards speaking. But I don't give a fuck, so I'm going to keep him there. Robert Whittaker. Now, this is a tough one because we've seen him lose to DDP. We've seen him lose to Israel Adesanya. Other than them, though, could you see Robert Whittaker losing to a good number of middleweight champions? Like, GSP was a middleweight champion, right? You think he'd beat GSP? I would argue that he would actually give GSP a really hard time at middleweight, and there's maybe a reason why GSP didn't want to defend that middleweight title because he knew that the Reaper was waiting in the wings, and that would have been a tough stylistic matchup for him. It honestly would have been. Anderson Silva, you could maybe see Robert Whittaker doing well against him. Ooh, this is a tough one. It's a real tough one for me. I'm gonna say loses. Or wins some, loses some. I'm going to say for Robert Whittaker because I could even see someone like Lyoto Machida giving Robert Whittaker a tough time just as far as the stylistic matchup goes. Robert Whittaker, yeah, I think loses some, wins some. Alexandre Pantoja, I'm sticking him at the top. As I said, I think he beats Demetrius Johnson. I do. I think he does. I think he's that much of a marauder. He's pretty much just the flyweight version of Marab. And UFC gods, a.k.a. Dana White, Hunter Campbell, whoever is behind the matchmaking, make this fight. Have Pantoja move up and challenge Murad Dvalishvili for the bantamweight title. We need to see these two marauders meet in the middle and just see what the fuck happens, because that would be a match made in heaven, right? These two with the pace they put on their opponents, right? We need to see that fight. Absolutely. I think Pantoja beats them all. And then we have Frankie Edgar. Now, this is the issue with ranking him anywhere above right here. It's just based off the fact that he was so fucking small for lightweight. Khabib would do dirty things to him, right? Islam would do dirty things to him, real dirty things to him. It's just the size, man. Benson Henderson beat him twice. It's hard to see Frankie Edgar beating a whole lot of lightweight champions. He was just like the little engine that could, man. So small, didn't care, was always the smaller man until he eventually decided to move down in weight, like way too late in his career. I feel like he should have done that earlier, maybe competed at featherweight more when he was in his prime. But Frankie Edgar, he gets all the respect in the world. One of my favorites of all time. The boxing, the wrestling, the pace he would put on his opponents, man. Absolute legend. But just down to the fact that he gave up so much size. At 155, he would lose to most lightweight champions for me. Then we get into Michael Bisping, and I think the same goes for him. I'd say he's one of the worst champions of all time. I know he's oftentimes regarded as that, and for that reason, I think he does lose to most of them. But I can't disrespect Bisping that much because there are some earlier middleweight champions that I could see Bisping piecing up a little bit. Then we have Anthony Pettis. I would say loses to most of the lightweight champs as well, especially when you get into the more recent lightweight roster. I believe he got completely beat up by Rafael dos Anjos at some point. I'm going to say he loses to most of them, man. He never had the heart. A little bit one-dimensional, but not necessarily. He had good jiu-jitsu. He's decent off of his back. A great striker. A truly great striker. But he just did not have the heart. And that was always the issue for Pettis. I think it was just the drive. It was just the drive for him. And I think he would lose to most. Yeah, I think he would lose to most. And then we have GSP. Now, this is a dicey one because he was the welterweight champion. And he was also the middleweight champion, so we need to rank him accordingly. I think he beats every welterweight champion in history. I think he beats Tyron Woodley. I think he beats Kamaru Usman. I think he beats all of them. I think he beats Bilal Muhammad. They're all just worse versions of him. All of them. I think he beats Robbie Lawler. They're all worse versions of GSP, 100%. I think he beats all of them. But how can I have DDP ranked up here? How can I have him ranked up here if GSP is also up here, right? But I just think that this potential matchup is so compelling, so out there, so bananas, that I feel like it honestly does make sense to rank them both here, because could you really choose the winner between a DDP and GSP matchup? That would be, for me, impossible to even predict. DDP, I think I would edge maybe just a little bit because of the size advantage, and GSP struggled a bit at middleweight, dude. But nah, I can't do it. I have to rank GSP. I have to rank GSP here. But he's going to be the highest, the upper echelon of beats most of them, because the only one who I could see beating him is DDP. Right? So, yeah, man, GSP, he suffers a little bit just based off the fact that he had that short little stint at middleweight. and we have DDP as the current reigning champion, and I'm just not too sure if I would pick him against DDP, man. I'm leaning towards DDP in that one, in that fantasy matchup. And then we have Jan Blachowicz. Ooh-hoo-hee-ha-hoo. This is a real hard one. I don't know where to rank him, man. I think he probably loses to most of them. I think Yuri beats him. I think he beats Jamal Hill. I think Poatan beats him again if they were to fight. I think Jan probably does beat. Nah, man. I'm actually going to rank him at win some, lose some, because I think he's quite underrated as far as champions go. And that scary fucking Jan Blachowicz run that he was on, dude, when he was knocking out Corey Anderson, knocking out Dominic Reyes, like some real scary dudes. He was just knocking them all out over and over again. Unfortunately, we never got to see him go against John Jones. I don't know why we never got to see that. It looked like the UFC was trying to set that up at one point. We never got it. But I think Jan Blachowicz is underrated. I'm going to say he wins some and loses some. And now Yuri Prochazka is a wild card, but I think he beats most of them. I think he's up there with Glover when it comes to those 205ers, and I think he's up there with John Jones as well, but John Jones is only down here because of the heavyweight factor. Right, just because of the heavyweight factor. You have to think about John Jones and his run at heavyweight so far. Would he beat every heavyweight champion in history? I'm not too sure I would say that he would, and the same thing goes for Yuri. I can see him beating a good majority of 205ers. I can see him cleaning out that whole Shogun Rua generation, most likely. But then you get into DC and you get into Jones. Like, being a 205 champion, right? It's just so hard to say that any of them would get through DC and John Jones, two of the, like, quite literally the greatest fighters of all time. Like, DC in his own right is at least in the top 10 of all time, and then John Jones, even though he's a drug cheat and a piece of shit, he's probably top 3, you know. But I can see Yuri Prochazka beating a good majority. And speaking of DC, he's going in the same spot. I think as far as these fighters go, this is probably how they should be ranked, most likely. If I was ranking them against one another, I would say, yeah, this kind of makes sense to me. Because DC, I think he beats a majority of heavyweight champs and light heavyweight champs, and that's just as simple as that. The only 205 champ I can see beating DC ever is John Jones. That's because we've seen it with our eyeballs. And the only heavyweight champs I can see beating DC is maybe Ngannou if he lands a big shot and gets lucky in the first round, maybe. I think heavyweight DC beats heavyweight John Jones personally. So honestly, DC is I would say just as close to being in the top tier as John Jones is, which is pretty wild. And then we get into Jizzy, man, Fradesanya. He's finished. But we have to show him a little bit of respect here. How do we see him doing against Sean Strickland? I mean, we've seen it. He got messed up by him, walked down, and choked out by DDP. I think a prime Anderson Silva beats this man. But I think other than that, man, Izzy beats most of the champions. Like, even though I'm a hater of his, I'm also a pretty fair dude. I'm pretty objective. And I just can't disrespect Izzy to a comical degree and rank him below beats most of them, because he arguably does beat most of them. And then we get into Francis Ngannou, and I think I'll rank him in the same spot, a heavyweight who I could honestly see beating every single champion of all time. Right? I can see him knocking out John Jones. Ooh, weirdly, I almost want to put Francis Ngannou up here. I kind of want to put him up there because that punch power, but we see the dissipation of his threat level after the first round, and just the speed in which he would gas out. Like, yeah, it was so impressive how often he was able to spark his opponents out in the first round, but it was such an alarming difference. Like, first round Ngannou versus like second round Ngannou. Obviously, we saw a different version of him, a completely different version of him against Stipe in their second fight. But every other fight we've seen of Ngannou's, the man is sucking air after the first round. So it's hard to definitively say that he beats every heavyweight champion. So I just won't say it, because I can see a prime Cain Velasquez like beating him quite handily, potentially even TKOing him in the later rounds, right, with that gas tank that he has. Stipe Miocic, tough one, but I think same thing goes for. I would say Cain Velasquez, Francis Ngannou, Stipe Miocic. That's like the holy trinity for me, and I can see all three of them beating one another. I can see that, so I'm going to put Stipe in beats most of them. Johnny Hendricks, Yeah, sure. He had a great fight while he was on rocket fuel with GSP. In my opinion, that was not a robbery, and it doesn't even matter in the first place because that result would have been overturned to a no contest regardless. So whether you think he was robbed or not makes no difference because he was a steroid cheat. We've seen him beat someone like a Robbie Lawler, and I would actually rank him in the same place that I ranked Robbie Lawler, and I'll put them side by side because that version of Johnny Hendricks, prime Johnny Hendricks, was a scary, scary man. And a brilliant win for GSP to have on the record, especially with the caveat of him testing positive after that fight. And I want you guys to know that wasn't washed Johnny Hendricks. Johnny Hendricks fought GSP and then still went on to win the title afterwards after having 2 great fights with Robbie Lawler. It was only after those fights that he became washed and then moved up to middleweight and became fat and got knocked out by Paulo Costa, okay? Big Rig is a very underrated champion in his time, but he was a drug cheat, unfortunately for him, and his career just went off the deep end, which is unfortunate because he had bombs in his hands and was a very high-level wrestler. And I think stylistically, when it comes down to it, skill for skill, I think he knocks out Matt Hughes. I think he probably beats BJ Penn. I think he beats a lot of those welterweights, to be honest, man. I think he does. Islam Makhachev, I'm putting him in beats most of them. I'm going to rank him up here because realistically, I think the dominance that we've seen from Khabib in the grappling, I believe would get it done against Islam Makhachev. I think he would beat Islam. I don't think Islam's as good on the feet as people say he is. I think he's a good counter striker, but when it's Islam Makhachev opening up with the striking, right? He's the one engaging. The man is actually very sloppy. He's very sloppy. He leads with his head a lot and does weird things, leaves his hands down. There are a lot of openings that I see, to catch Islam. And I think we actually saw that with Moicano. It looked like Moicano landed a check left while Islam just fucking reached in with his head. And I think the difference on the ground, the dominance that each man has showed, I don't see Islam being able to beat Khabib, but it is possible, right? Because he's much better than Khabib on the feet. Although I think the difference on the ground is so much greater in Khabib's favor. The dominance, dude. The dominance was it's just different. It's different. Khabib would get you down, and it almost seemed like it was curtains right then and there. With Islam, there seems to be some leeway. I'll put Islam there, although he is teetering the line of being ranked at the very, very, very top. Anderson Silva, this is a tough one, dude, because he is the greatest middleweight of all time. I can see him beating a prime. I'm going to say beats most of them. I will rank him up there. Is the only one I can see definitively beating him, or at least one that I can say beats him without a shadow of a doubt, is DDP. And I can even see Sean Strickland getting it done against him, man. I can see stylistically Sean Strickland, as I said, is a fucking nightmare. I would hate to fight someone like Sean Strickland. I really would. Would be the most frustrating thing of all time. And then we get into Davison Figueiredo. We are ranking him against the other flyweight champions. I mean, we've seen him do very well against Pantoja, and I think he's one of the only fighters in the UFC with that kind of power to where he could hurt someone like Pantoja, and we've seen him hurt Pantoja. So weirdly, he's the only one who actually has a chance against Pantoja, which is crazy, but I think Pantoja probably still beats him if they fight again. Then Pantoja against Moreno, he beat him once, I believe. Lost a couple. I think he would do well against Henry Cejudo. Demetrius Johnson, that would be a real tough fight for Johnson. I'm going to say Davis Figueiredo wins some and loses some. Aljamain Sterling, I was never really big on his style. I never really considered him much of a fighter when it comes down to it. He's a great grappler. Everything on the feet is window dressing. I don't know. He's had so many close fights, like razor-thin fights against Henry Cejudo, razor-thin against Peter Yan the second time around. It is tough, man. Because as far as current bantamweight champ goes, I think Merab beats Aljamain Sterling. I think even though on paper Peter Yan has 2 losses to Aljamain Sterling, I think ultimately Aljamain Sterling, like even someone like Dominic Cruz, when you really get down to it, they're both similar on the feet, very little danger in the hands. But I think Dominic Cruz actually mixes up the striking and the grappling more effectively. So I could even see Dominic Cruz having a good time against Aljamain Sterling. Cody Garbrandt arguably has the speed and the power to put someone like Aljamain Sterling out. I think he's middle of the pack when it comes to like comparing him to other bantamweight champions throughout history. I think he's in the win some, lose some category. That might be controversial though, and I wouldn't blame you for saying that it is. And then we have, oh boy, JDS, one of my favorite heavyweights of all time, arguably my very favorite heavyweight. Has a crazy resume. He really does, dude. I'm going to say wins some, loses some. You could even argue he deserves to be up here, but I can't justify having that many heavyweights in that particular tier. So I'm going to say JDS wins some, loses some. Chris Weidman loses to most of them. I'm going to stick him right there. One of the most overrated champions of all time. 2 fluke wins against Anderson Silva. Like, just get out of my face with Chris Weidman. And then last but not least, we have Khabib Nurmagomedov, man. And I have to rank him up here. I'm not the biggest fan of Khabib. I think he has a very overrated resume. I think his overall legacy is a bit questionable when you look at the names he put up. I think he retired way too early, in my personal opinion. Didn't take enough risks, but I can't see any other lightweight champion beating him. I just can't see it. It's as simple as that. Khabib's grappling was that one trick. I know grappling is not one trick in and of itself, but it's just Khabib's grappling. He didn't have to know how to strike. He didn't know how to do anything else. He just knew how to drag you down to the ground and drown you like no one else in UFC history ever could. So Khabib beats them all, and that does conclude this long-ass tier list, man. This was a long watch. I'm sorry if this was too long, if you couldn't stay locked in for this, or if you enjoy the long-form content, then I suppose I should say you're welcome. But I do appreciate you watching regardless, man. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about my placements, whether you agree, you disagree, doesn't matter, man. Just let me know in the comment section below. And anyway, guys, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.